Good afternoon. Welcome to this month's installment of Creation Justice webinars. If you are concerned about this common home of ours called Earth, if you are concerned about neighbors near and far, you are in the right place today, because we are all about taking that care, that concern, that love that each of us has and turning it into action. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. As always, I am joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is raising the trumpet for justice in Birmingham, Alabama, where he is the executive director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power Light. Michael, as I have said, we are all about action. And in coping with the many crises that we face today in the world, I'm always telling people, I recommend that your therapy be action. But we can't just take action willy-nilly without a plan, without some core values directing that plan, and without listening to others who know best what's most needed. Thankfully, we have brought together some panelists today who will speak about how justice and equity can guide our response when disaster strikes. Faith communities have such tremendous potential when our steps are aligned with our highest purposes. Michael, before we introduce our speakers, what are your thoughts today in framing our topic?
Yeah, thank you, Brooks. And thank you to our guests. So one of our shared faith values is justice. I believe that I can feel secure in saying that people of faith and conscience share an acknowledgement of justice. Doing justice is another matter. Doing justice has often been interpreted as doing just us. We see this magnified when disaster strikes. When disaster strikes, the haves benefit while the have-nots bear the burden. When disaster strikes, our beloved LGBTQIA family is restricted because of their truth. When disaster strikes, our incarcerated are discarded as waste. Yet we who are of faith and conscious are called to a much higher standard. Our North Star of doing justice is called equity, where we call attention to and care for those who have been forced to survive outside of the margins. We see to it that they are cared for first. When disaster strikes, we are called to care. We are called to advocate for those who are underseen, overseen, undervalued, and under-resourced. Beloved, the reality is that the way policy is moving to address this crisis that we face, we will experience more disasters. We are here today to learn how to advocate and who to advocate to. We're in this together and cannot make it without one another. Let's do justice together.
Thank you, Michael, as always, for those wonderful words and getting us centered and focused on our topic for today as we're grounded. To jump right into this important subject matter, I'll now introduce our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking. First up, we will have the Reverend Fred Mead, who became involved in disaster work while serving a United Church of Christ church in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. Since then, Mead has assumed an array of disaster response leadership roles and teaching roles. At one point, he was the disaster response spiritual care lead for the Red Cross in Massachusetts. He is a senior instructor for the National Disaster Interfaith Network. He is the disaster coordinator for the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. I could go on listing the many disaster roles and responsibilities that he holds, but I will conclude by simply saying he does all of this while serving as a pastor. He is currently the interim minister of Chapel Street Congregational Church in Rhode Island. Our second speaker for today is Marcy Roth. She is the executive director and CEO of the World Institute on Disability, which works to advance the rights and opportunities of over 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide. Roth's focus on improving emergency preparedness and disaster outcomes for people with disabilities and her focus on building accessible, disaster-resilient communities began in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, while advising the White House on the rights and urgent needs of people with disabilities living in the area around Ground Zero. She was appointed by President Obama to serve as senior advisor to the administrator of FEMA from 2009 to 2017. While at FEMA, she established the Office of Disability Integration and Coordination and served as its director. Our third speaker today is Marcus Coleman Jr. He was appointed by the Biden administration as the director of the Department of Homeland Security's Center for Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships in the Office of the FEMA Administrator. In the announcement of Coleman's appointment, his role in working with faith communities to strengthen equity in emergency management was highlighted. Coleman began working with FEMA in 2010 and has assumed a number of roles. In 2016, he won the FEMA Administrator's Award for his work to encourage collaboration between faith leaders and first responders. His work has included co-developing FEMA's guidance for engaging faith-based and community organizations. We are delighted to have each of these panelists with us today, and we will begin with the Reverend Fred Mead. We need to unmute you, Fred.
Well, I'm delighted to be here and to share with you a little bit from my perspective of what I've experienced. I have been on many, many disasters around the country, both in Massachusetts as well as in other states. And as Brooks said, yes, I was serving a church in New Orleans when Katrina hit. And it certainly opened up my eyes to what happens to people when they walk through trauma. I was living in a shelter for 3 months. So if you could imagine that reality in of itself, that should give you a little bit of a wake-up call, because it certainly was for me. It was Katrina for me was like a second baptism, because I began to see a whole nother level of what can happen to people and to organizations when a disaster happens. My primary concern today is to get you to think about, I know that it's important to take action in terms of social justice issues. My concern is that when we take action, that we come from a place of being grounded in Christ. And as a disaster pastor, and I'll talk a little bit later about what that means, it's vitally important that when we take action, that we are grounded in our faith belief system. That's so vitally important, because the work that we do should come out of our relationship to God primarily. A lot of the work that I do in practice as a disaster pastor or as a chaplain or as a spiritual care provider is simply something we call compassionate, non-anxious presence. And when I talk about that, that is a learned skill. You know, people think that they can listen. I've trained people all across the United States. I've trained thousands of people. And one of the worst things that I can say about pastors is that many of them simply don't know how to listen. That may sound strange, but that's true. And so our action should come out of really listening to the needs of the people around us. And that requires training. There's a significant difference between a local church pastor and a disaster pastor. There's a significant difference between someone who's involved in mental health and does their practice in the quietness of their office, and a mental health provider who's out on the scene. And part of that is it's important for you all to understand that not all licensed mental health providers are trauma-informed care providers. And if you have trauma in your background, you need to make sure that you look for people who can help you with that. I work with Leslie Romley from the National Disaster Setting. If you have questions about what we do in that setting, you should certainly email her. I was the first to come on board as a spiritual care provider with our new team, and hopefully we will be deploying at some point to help local churches and boards of deacons deal with what happens. Trauma is common across the United States. and some of the work that you all may be doing, you may be traumatized yourself. And it's very important that if you experience that, simply you get the help you need, because trauma is something that simply doesn't go away. And that trauma can come directly from the work you do. It can come from your childhood. It could come from trying to do good things. It could come from growing up in a very difficult neighborhood. It could come from being assaulted physically. There's a lot of places that it can come, but it does change your view of reality. And one of the things that happens when we are traumatized is that it does change, and we have to deal with that. We have to come face to face with that with the appropriate kind of help so that we can envision for ourselves a new reality, which includes that, and even potentially grow from that. That's vitally important. One of the things I teach is I talk about post-traumatic growth, which is a really important idea for faith-based leaders to understand. You can Google it, get familiar with it, so that you know how to grow from what are often difficult experiences in life. One of the things that makes a disaster pastor different than a normal pastor is when you're out in the field, you don't have the comfort of going back home and lying down and knitting yourself back together. We're trained as disaster pastors to be with people on the worst days of their life. And I've literally, as I said earlier, spoken to thousands of people. We know how to knit ourselves back together again. We know how to differentiate between post-traumatic stress, which is a kind of a normal response after bad things happen, as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. We know how, when we're working with people, to see the difference between the two, to know when to refer to mental health, or to be able to say, you're just having a normal reaction. And that's why when you have a highly inspired, lowly educated pastor working within the disaster field, that they really should, in order to take care of themselves, get some training. And if you want to look for some training, you can contact Leslie Romley at our national setting, and she can make some recommendations. As I said earlier, I do teach around the nation, including FEMA. We just ran a series of courses for them on understanding stress and stress management. And one of the things that when we talk about stress management is to know that all of us experience stress differently. There's no one right way to experience stress, if you can say that. But it hits all of us either in our body, in our minds, in our emotions, in our relationships, and even in our relationship to God. So as someone who teaches this stuff, one of the things I try and do is to get people in touch with how stress affects you uniquely. So that if all of a sudden, for me, one of my stress management tools is if I can't find my keys or my iPhone, I know I'm pretty stressed out because I've lost that something in my brain that I have cognitive impairment. I can laugh at myself and say that, but that means that a part of me is not working. And I have certain things that I know ahead of time that I can do to manage that stress. And that's true for all of those 5 different areas: body, mind, emotions, relationships, and a relationship to God. So it's important to be able to know how stress affects you individually. And then when you're off track, know how to give yourself a prescription for whatever that might be. The power of listening is absolutely incredibly important in what disaster chaplains do. As I said, I've spoken to people in terrible situations, and I know what happens to people's brains when they are traumatized. They can't think clearly for sometimes as long as 3 days. Who we are, we don't have access up here to our prefrontal cortex, that part of our brain that thinks sequentially, thinks clearly. And so when people are out after a disaster happens to them, or even people out in the field who are serving others, which can be equally traumatic, we call that compassionate fatigue or secondary traumatization. Now the term is secondary PTSD. We can become traumatized by other people. When that happens, we shouldn't expect people, if you come on a disaster scene, to be able to think logically. And that's so vitally important. And if we're there to give people information, you need to be able to write it down and give it to them. I practice what's called compassionate humility. I've taken a lot of courses on cultural competence. And I always, in as much as I think I'm reasonably well educated, personally, I can never know what it's like to be a 16-year-old African-American male growing up as a Muslim in America. However, I can create the space, what I call a sacred space, to show compassion and create a space where we simply can listen and get to know one another better without judgment. And that, my friends, is a very powerful tool. And among other things, I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to neurobiology, is that when we fully listen to people, the oxytocin, which the brain produces, helps lower people's stresses. I don't know if you've ever felt good after somebody's actually listened to you, but that's our brain helping us to connect to other people and lower our stress. And again, I want to say that listening is a learned skill, and it's a very effective skill to use. In terms of disaster, post-disaster work, in all of our organizations, the greatest asset we have is people. There's no question about that. But our friends and our family members who do this work have to be good people who are well educated, who are compassionate, who have an understanding of how the work that we are so impassioned to do can affect us personally. Jesus regularly took time to go out and pray, to be centered. And I think because of that, he was able, among many other things, to do the kind of work that he did. It is so vitally important. So I would strongly encourage you, if you want to do this work, or if you have memories of really bad times in your life doing this work, or early childhood memories, get the kind of help that you can get either through a chaplain, or through a faith-based provider, or through a mental health provider, because it eventually will catch up to you. So I think that's about 10 minutes, and I hope this was very helpful.
Thank you, Fred. And we'll now turn things over to Marcy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Marcy Roth, and as introduced earlier, I am the Executive Director of the World Institute on Disability. Before I start, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the land I am speaking from is the traditional and unceded Piscataway and Tuscarora territory. I am a proud woman with a disability, and I'm an older white woman with COVID gray curly hair, red glasses, black and white top, and I am sitting in front of a backdrop that shows the logo of my organization, the World Institute on Disability. The World Institute on Disability has a global mission to continually advance the rights and opportunities of over 1 billion people with disabilities globally. We do this through our core services, which are accessibility and universal design solutions, policies, tools, and resources for global community living, and emergency preparedness, disaster risk reduction, and climate resilience, inclusive of people with disabilities. I'm going to talk during my 10 minutes about disability justice and equity before, during, and after disasters, inclusive of people with disabilities. So you may or may not know that according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 1 in 4 adults has some sort of disability. It's a number that actually surprises people. In fact, as we age, the reality is that each of us will acquire a disability unless we die before that happens. So everyone will eventually have the experience, the very natural experience of disability. And the more we do now, the easier and more accessible the journey is for all of us. So this is not just simply work that we do for some other people. This is work that we do for every community, and it will benefit each and every one of us. So when we talk about the whole community, certainly we're talking about that 26% of the population, people with disabilities. We're also talking about, in the circumstances of a disaster, many other people who are referred to as individuals with access and functional needs. So this is a group of people who may not identify as having disabilities, who may not, in the regular course of their life, utilize services, tools, equipment related to disability. But these are folks who, in the circumstances of a disaster, need information that is accessible and actionable to them, may need physical environments that accommodate their immediate needs. Programs and services may need to be accommodating so that they can fully participate. And really, when you think about all of the people who might, in fact, benefit from an universally designed and inclusive emergency planning approach, in fact, it benefits the whole community, because the more that people with disabilities and others who also have access and functional needs can maintain our health, our safety, our independence, our dignity, that optimizes those very limited resources in a disaster. So, as we think about this, it's important that you understand that according to the United Nations, children and adults with disabilities and older adults are 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or to die in a disaster. And this is not because of their disability. This is because of a lack of planning, accessibility, and accommodation. The United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction recognizes that not only are people with disabilities disproportionately affected by disasters, but crucially, that their knowledge and leadership skills are essential for building resilient, inclusive, and equitable societies. So not only are we not a liability in disasters, in fact, if we're included, if we're part of the planning, if we're given the accessibility that we require, we can in fact become assets to the disaster impacted community. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, ask yourself, are we talking about people with disabilities? We often leave disability out in our DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions. And without the inclusion of the whole community, we will never achieve true equity and inclusion. So this is important, again, not only for the people who are excluded, but what happens to people with disabilities has a direct impact, not only on them, but on the rest of society. And, it used to be that we would think about disability from a medical model as the consequence of a health condition, disease, or as a result of trauma, and that it would disrupt the functioning of the person in a physical way or in a cognitive way. Over time, we started to think about that more from being a physical, medical, or cognitive deficit, and that it limited the functions that a person could perform. And we have moved to what's known as a social model. And that is that a person's activities are limited not by the impairment or condition, but by the environment. Barriers are consequences of a lack of social organization. And so when we think about disability justice centers intersectionality and the ways diverse systems of oppression amplify and reinforce one another. So certainly we are invested in a rights-based approach, but in fact, for people with disabilities, fighting for our rights means fighting for what everybody else already has. And we would like to fight rather for a more just world, and disability justice brings us, especially in the circumstances related to climate, the circumstances related to disasters of all kinds, the opportunity to eliminate those barriers at the front end rather than having to navigate to recognize our rights. And we would ask that all of you think about whether a rights and justice-based approach is the stronger way to build a community, or whether continuing a charity-based model, does that really build the strength of our community? Everyone feels really good when we provide charity, but for the people who are the recipients, that charity may not be what they're looking for. It may be that they're looking for access and inclusion. So I have so much more to say, but I'm at the top of my 10 minutes, and I'll look forward to answering questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcy, and we will now transition to Marcus.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am extremely honored to be with you today. Grateful for the United Church of Christ and its partners, including Reverend Malcolm and the various organizations that he represents in the Interfaith Power of Light. Thankful for the diverse attendance. I see some emergency managers on the line, as well as people of faith, and some of the community leaders that are joining us as well. And eternally grateful for Reverend Mead and Marcy Roth for their insightful remarks. I was off camera for a good bit, scribbling and taking notes feverishly, and did not want to distract from the things that I was learning from their presentations. My name is Marcus Coleman, and I serve as the director for the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the Department of Homeland Security. We are one of 11 centers of the White House Office of the Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And I want to talk to you today about a few things, but first, I think I just want to kind of recap some key themes and things that we heard from our prior presenters. I appreciate the good Reverend starting with a conversation about you as leaders, as managers, as people, and that importance of emotional and self-care and compassion for you as an individual. If you are on this webinar, you probably have been at that place where the well has run dry, where nobody poured into you, but you poured into everyone else. And it is very important that we keep in mind that emotional and spiritual care and self-compassion that's needed as leaders, as we find ourselves as leaders in disasters. Marcy's point, being aware of the structures that we navigate from the sectors we represent, from the communities that we're involved in, from the places that we sit, and knowing that we can accept the structures as it is, as a status quo. I do not think this is this audience, or we can find ways to upend the ways that we view and engage those structures through the lens of climate justice, environmental justice, disability justice, and those in environment and other types of things that we focus on as an organization. For FEMA's position, where my office sits, we are focused on coming alongside partners like the Reverend, like Marcy Roth, like Reverend Malcolm, like the UCC, and those of you on this call, to continue to drive forward what continues to be a severe and a very devastating conversation for how do we help continue to support those that are disproportionately impacted by disasters, and how we find ways, again, to relook at how we are approaching the structures that are built around us to better support those disproportionately impacted. Practically speaking, what does that mean? I was sworn in on August 4th, 2021, right before Hurricane Henri, right before the floods in Tennessee, right before Hurricane Ida, which is on the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and right before those tornadoes in Kentucky, in a global pandemic, while the community is recovering from wildfires. And there were three things that I knew instinctively that we needed to focus on. One is continuing to think proactively, not just during disasters, but before. How do we instill equity as a foundation of emergency management? That's a lot of hard conversations, and rightfully so. Many of you may come from an advocacy position during disasters, but that instilling equity is key, not only to me, but to our administrator, FEMA Administrator Criswell, which she laid out as her first and top priority in the FEMA strategic plan. Number two, how do we think about building whole community partnerships and what we talk about at FEMA as community resilience, but acknowledging the disproportionate impacts of climate change, not just as an inevitability, but on something that we can take action today to help mitigate some of those impacts. And then number three, collectively as a discipline, when we talk about emergency management or whole community, how do we continue to promote and sustain a ready FEMA and a prepared nation? It goes back to a little bit of what Marcy talked about with when we're speaking about inclusivity, when we're speaking about equity, when we're speaking about diversity, are we including all people in that conversation, not as an annex or an appendix afterwards, but are we co-creating and building those tables so when we deliver that service or when we're delivering that program, it is truly reflective and representative of the communities we engage. Through my office, we support those three strategic plan goals in a few ways, a few things that I'd invite for your consideration as we transition to the Q&A shortly. The first area of focus for us is we are in a posture still of active listening. So when I say active, it's not just that you call me and you talk or you get on the phone and I talk to you, but we want to absorb the lessons learned and the ideas and partnerships that you have. I know in a prior life, Marcy and I had worked closely together, and she's actually the one that introduced me to a resource from the American Association of People with Disabilities called So That All May Worship, which gave just a baseline understanding of for faith communities, how to be more inclusive with their engagement. The second area that's incredibly important to me is making sure, again, that we're not only caring for those immediate disaster survivors who are seeking services, but we also care for those people who find themselves leading as disaster survivors. So I think Reverend Mead's point about the pastors who are in the tornado zone that everyone's looking to are a survivor themselves, and coming alongside and equipping alongside partners like the National Disaster Interfaith Network and others. How do we give the resources, tools, training, and the types of things that we can develop from FEMA and make sure that we're getting on the front end of equipping our partners like the UCC, like those on the call, with that necessary training, considerations through exercises and the like. And the third, when we think about all disasters, a very important point of the administrator and a very important point to this administration is we have to completely rethink what FEMA program delivery looks like through all phases of the disaster. So that means not just the recovery work, which we have done, we've expanded access to people as it relates to FEMA individual assistance. That's the assistance that helps individuals directly. But we need to really think about, as we are developing and expanding and modifying our disaster preparedness programs, our hazard mitigation programs, and some of our other programs, how are we finding other ways to instill equity, again, through a co-creative and co-collaborative process? One area of interest when we speak of disasters, I know we're talking a lot about the natural disaster in this instance, but invite you to know one area that we're equally focused on is man-made disasters as well. It is on my heart and not lost on me that many of you joining this call are not just concerned about the impacts from the hurricanes, the tornadoes, but maybe you're in the community providing emotional and spiritual care to communities that have been threatened with a bomb threat. Maybe you're in a community or connected to communities that are concerned about other man-made disasters and other man-made hazards. And let's speak about it. When we talk about disasters, I think people go to the worst catastrophic vision, but maybe your neighborhood was just impacted by the second or third apartment or house fire, and you want to get a sense of how you can engage in those conversations. And so we provide some resources. We look forward to continuing to engaging with partners like you all. It's a little bit about our office, a little bit about our work, and happy to share those resources. One, with the group that's here, I'll drop the information in the chat and also my contact information. And make sure we have 3 more minutes to address the full questions that we were going to address today. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Marcus. Reverend Mead, there's a question for you. It says, say more or again about how you identify the transfer of trauma to you when relating to others in trauma. What do you do about it?
Great question. First of all, there is a huge difference between post-traumatic stress, which we experience anytime we're involved in disaster work, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's one whole category, and that someone has to actually experience the symptoms of post-traumatic stress for more than 30 days. And at that point, a licensed mental health provider can then do the assessment work and say, yes, you have post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that you can be set up in a kind of self-care plan with your therapist. As a chaplain, what I do is I try and normalize what people are going through. And I know as a result of being in difficult situations that it definitely has affected me. And anytime you listen to someone who's in pain, it affects you, it changes you. And that's normal. And what's important that a lot of people don't understand is that there is a cumulative effect to stress. It's not just like you're one and done. When we go through difficult moments, it adds up over time. And at some point, we can no longer see the life that's in front of us clearly. So stress does add up. It affects our ability to see, it affects our ability to function. And when I talked about the 5 different ways that stress affects us, it really is a kind of self-assessment. You know, are you thinking clearly? Are your emotions on track? Are you wanting to beat up your pet goldfish? You know, how are you doing in your relationships? Are you being supportive or not supportive? How are you doing with your understanding of God? I've taught from everyone from Muslims to Sikhs to Hindus to priests to Protestants. We all experience stress the same way. It boils down to those 5 different ways. So it's important that if you're feeling overwhelmed, that you ask those kinds of questions and then you look for the kind of help you need. Sometimes just talking with a close friend is enough, or a spouse if you have one. Sometimes you need to go the next level and speak to someone who's trauma-informed, who has a trauma-informed care background. And that could be a priest or a rabbi or an imam, or it could be a local chaplain. And if you don't know those people, then maybe you need to speak to a mental health provider who is trauma-informed care. What you don't want to do if you have a trauma background is speak to someone who doesn't have trauma-informed care background. And it was always surprising to me. It was like a wake-up call when I heard that you could be a licensed mental health provider and not have a background in terms of dealing with trauma. That is really important for people. You know, I've gone personally through EMDR. It's one of the forms that is helpful. There are CBT, DBT. There's a number of forms of therapy that can be helpful, but it's really up to the individual to do the self-assessment, and then they have to take the next steps.
Thank you, Fred, for that response. Marcy, I've got a question for you as someone who has worked from the inside and really has done the work of institutional change. I mean, you literally were instituting new programs within FEMA. What lessons might you impart to our audience about how to advocate for change in the inside or outside? What what makes that happen? And how do we get people as good as you and they're doing that work? And so if you have some insights on how to make institutional change happen, that would be much welcome.
Well, this is Marcy, and I thank you for the question and for your kind words. So more than anything else, it's about partnerships. More than anything else, it's about relationships. When I was inside the government, I relied on community partners to identify issues, identify what would work in their communities. In the disability community, we have a saying, nothing about us without us. And we feel very strongly that people with lived experience are the people who need to be at the head of the table. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley says it probably better than anyone. The people closest to the pain should be the people closest to the power. And so when I was on the government side, it was really important to me that we made space for those community leaders and that we centered their expertise and their voices. And now working from the outside, I find that people are, some folks, Marcus is a wonderful example of this. Some folks get the power of these kinds of partnerships. And when we work together, it'll sound hokey, but we're really unstoppable. When there are barriers, it is extremely difficult to make change, and certainly to make change that lasts. One other thing I'll say about this is we have struggled from the disability community. We have really struggled over the last 5 years or so because those partnerships haven't been what they need to be. And making change, significantly shifting those paradigms, it requires that everybody stay with it. We're making huge progress globally. We're not making such great progress here in the US at this point.
Marcy, thank you for that. And especially invoking, I am Miss Ayanna Pressley. I love that. I love that. Marcus, let me ask you this, and please allow me a moment to set this up. We are the Creation Justice Ministry, our Creation Justice webinar. Part of that justice is that environmental justice piece, a climate justice piece. And Dr. Fred, you probably will have to come in as well, because this is a two-pronged question. One of the things that we experience when we deal with environmental justice is the stress that comes with it. We call those environmental stressors. This is a disaster that is occurring on an everyday basis, that is happening to communities day in and day out. It's a 24/7 disaster that they have to live within. How are you engaging communities of faith in the process of dealing with environmental justice, Mr. Marcus? And as well, Rev, how would you advise those chaplains or those ministers who would be ministering in that hospitable, that hostile environment where they're experiencing this slow violence every day?
Reverend Malcolm, thank you for that question. And I think there's two examples that I would like to share, but I will just share one to make sure that we leave space for our other panelists. So post impact of Hurricane Ida, was able to actually spend some time at Tapachula's Chapel in Reserve, Louisiana. For those that don't know, that is a church that is located directly next to chemical facility and has a very long and storied history of advocating for environmental justice, and also very aware of some of the impacts of climate change and climate justice. And being able to talk to the pastor, it was enlightening for me to learn a few things. One, the mitigation projects that happened since Katrina up to that point developed an infrastructure where a lot of the flooding and concerns about flood damage were moving further and further away from those communities that were impacted in 2005, but were still vulnerable in 2022. Number two, the thing that we should be mindful of, and I know for FEMA, we are mindful of, when we talk about climate resilience, when we talk about climate change, we are also speaking to some of the lessons that we know to be true from our partners at EPA about making sure we have a concerted focus on environmental justice and having that in not just our conversations about what happens post-disaster, but to your point, Reverend Malcolm, the everyday disasters. Number three, and this kind of goes back to the partnerships and accountability. I got to Tapachula's Chapel because an organization called Faith in Action and a few very good pastors and deacons in love called me in and said, hey, we got communities that haven't been engaged and we need to find some practical ways to get information and resources to those communities. We will work with you to establish an opportunity to learn what's happening in the community, but we need your help. We need people to register for disaster assistance. And it was through that partnership, they actually had a food drive at the church. Now, mind you, the church is partially destroyed, but the pastors and the communities are working with the NAACP, the Coalition of Power and Equity in Louisiana. And so during that food drive, we're able to call in some of our other federal partners to help people do things ranging from disaster, getting people registered for disaster assistance. But I took the time, we are taking the time as FEMA to also spend time through our civil rights officers and the like to learn about some of the systemic issues that are going to impact these communities long before hurricanes like that happen and long after. So that's one practical example of how we can work with the faith community anywhere a disaster has impacted a community to make sure that we are meeting those that may not be picked up by what would be considered a traditional emergency response.
I've got a follow-up question, which is, something that I observed with Flint and other places that have experienced environmental disasters. Sometimes churches with good intentions will respond and they'll jump right in and they'll say, they'll put together a whole truckload of supplies to go to wherever they think is most needed, but maybe they haven't asked or heard what's actually needed. So like maybe the community doesn't need water bottles, but they're bringing them anyways. And I guess my question is, certainly we can do webinars like this to raise awareness, but is there kind of a mechanism of communication to like get the word out? Like when a disaster happens to our churches and faith communities, say, this is what's needed, this is not what's needed. I mean, can you help explain to us, kind of how people should be getting plugged in to do the right thing in those moments? Any of you, if you
I'm gonna defer it to Fred. Fred, this is like Fred's jam.
Yes and no. The first thing I want to say is that, especially as leaders, we need to become familiar with VOAD, Volunteer Organizations Active in Disaster. And in any given community, you may not even be aware that if you have a disaster, there are faith-based organizations around our country that will come in and help you out. And that's so vitally important. If you need rebuilds, if you need someone to take care of your children while you're going around at a resource and response community, if you need food, if you need shelter, all those things can be done fairly quickly because of VOAD. And if you don't know what VOAD is and you're in this field, shame on you. National VOAD, it's extremely important. Every state should have a VOAD system set up to help people in disaster. They can provide the practical skill sets. I did get a question that came to me from someone, and I should have included it in my presentation, and the individual wanted to know is how, is there a way that I can evangelize someone after a disaster? Is there a way I can come and have a come to Jesus moment? And I would say absolutely not, that is unethical, that we're there for the needs of other people. We're not there to pass out our business cards, we just like we don't pass out offering plates when we work in a disaster. We don't. We do it from our hearts. We do it simply because it's the right thing to do. We simply show the name of Jesus, but through our actions, through our compassionate listening. And in fact, and I have, met people who were organizations that were crusading for Christ on the disaster scene. And I basically have had to have my come to Jesus moment with them because it is simply wrong. People who have been affected by disaster are extremely vulnerable. They need to be able to have someone who can lower their stress and help them get in touch with the kinds of things that they need to do to take the next step in their lives. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I do. It is words that I absolutely live by, and it's important. It's important that as leaders that we work within certain guidelines that are put out by VOED after a disaster, and there are many.
Thank you, Fred. That's a very helpful response. And Marcus, I see your hand is raised.
I'd be remiss, I did not do this in my opening comments. I think the beautiful thing about the United Church of Christ is they are a member of the National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, and the leadership and work of Leslie Ramali, that is a point of contact if you were connected with the UCC. And we also seen in the chat, which I appreciate, some of the audience members dropping other organizations, including the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. Of course, Marcy's organization, she does it domestically and globally. So you have a number of partners that are kind of in that space that'll be glad to connect with you and partner with you to build that capacity, as Fred had talked about.
And let me hop on the gratitude train as well and thank Leslie for, she identified our wonderful panelists for today. And so thank you, Leslie, for that. And also to say that we've been really fortunate to partner on this webinar with our Disabilities Ministries in the United Church of Christ, as well as our Disaster Ministries. And so great to have these partnerships and to have everybody with us here today. Reverend Michael, any questions or thoughts as we start to bring this to a close?
Actually, I was going to close with what Fred said, but he stole my thunder at the end of that. I was going to address that question that was asked. Just to reemphasize, we aren't in the process of evangelizing by word when we go into disaster issues, whether it be or traumatic issues, whether it be environmental justice, whether it be movement building, when we take action, or when disaster strikes. Our job is to be present. The most holiest thing that we can do for anyone is to simply be present. Simply be present. Sometimes it's not even in words, it's just being with. And to do anything other than that is, as Rev just told us, unethical. So listen, I want you all to go out in love, knowing that we can still win, knowing that we've got a fight ahead of us, but we've got strong allies on our side, and greater is the one that's within us than anything that may come against us in this world. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you again for your thoughts. Thank you for your information that you gave us, but even more than that, thank you for your passion for us. Rev, Dr. Brooks, is back in your hands again.
Yes, thank you so much. We are grateful for all of our speakers and panelists today. Just very insightful, and I know how much you are appreciated. We will continue on here in a few moments. We are fortunate today to have Thaddeus Elliott with us, who is a new fellow for our advocacy office in our Washington, D.C. for the UCC. He will be leading us in an action alert session for those who wish to stick around past the top of the hour so that we can know what's happening in Congress and what can we do to further change, to really make some system change, institutional change, and that happens through advocacy with Congress. There are some things that are present and are actionable. And so that's what we love to have. And that's what Thaddeus will be bringing to us as we stick around after this. And so thank you again to each of our panelists. We are so grateful that your remarks and insights will live on in the world of YouTube and will be a continued resource for us. And again, thanks to Disaster Ministries of UCC and Disabilities Ministries of UCC for partnering with us in this webinar.